Welcome to ACP. I'm your host, Alex Bollfrass, the head of strategy, technology, and arms control at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in Berlin. On each episode, we welcome the world's leading experts in arms control to share their knowledge and assessments of the most critical issues. Whether you're new to the topic or need a refresher, I hope you will join us in our exploration of everything related to arms control. In this season, we offer primers on all the nuclear weapons arsenals currently existing in the world and their relationship to arms control. I hope it helps you better know a nuke.
It was obvious early on that France did not have the means to develop an arsenal that could be based on counterforce strategies or follow the trends of the Soviet Union or the US, but that you have the strategy you can afford.
Emmanuelle Macron, a couple of years ago, held a speech in which he basically said, "You folks come to Paris and we talk about nuclear deterrence." And nobody understood what is on the table, what is he actually talking about.
There are no lists of vital interests, because if you say precisely to your adversary, okay, I will answer with nuclear weapons only if you hit this and this, but if you hit something else, I won't answer.
Today, we turn to France, a country that has long insisted on the independence of its deterrent. What drives its nuclear policy and its reluctance to engage in arms control? What role does it play in European security, and would it be possible to expand that role? To help us better know this nuke, we're joined by leading experts on French nuclear strategy. Our first guest is Héloïse Fayet, the research fellow and head of the Deterrence and Proliferation program at the French Institute of International Relations.
Seeing the use of a nuclear weapon in Japan, seeing the development by the US, by the USSR, the French government at the time understood that we needed a French nuclear weapon in order to gain status, in order also to assure our own defense, a French own deterrence. The bureau to create the first French nuclear weapon was created in 1954. There was a lot of money dedicated to the program. And when Charles de Gaulle came back to power in 1958 and became a French president within the Fifth Republic, he gave the final impulsion to really get a French nuclear weapon to work and to be used within the deterrence and defense strategic posture of France. The first French nuclear test was in February 1960.
Emmanuelle Maitre, a senior nuclear weapons researcher at the Foundation for Strategic Research in Paris, continues with the motivation behind the French nuclear program.
The idea from Charles de Gaulle that you cannot rely on an ally for your own security when a nuclear war is at stake, and that only a national deterrence can be really credible. At the time, it was probably influenced by events that the leaders had experienced. They had been deeply marked by the invasion twice of the French territory, the defeat in 1940, and the Nazi invasion had really marked the psyche. Other elements probably also had influence. After the Second World War, France was involved in colonial war and realized that it could not rely on the support of its ally for these situations. Indochina in particular, where the United States was not willing to commit very deeply. The Suez Affair in 1956, which is often mentioned also as an element that triggered this idea that France and Britain could not rely on the US being always there to support their policy decisions. These elements contributed to creating this obsession with being sovereign, being independent in developing a nuclear deterrent.
Héloïse Fayet continues the story with changes to the French nuclear arsenal at the end of the Cold War.
During the Cold War, we had this full triad, so land component, airborne and seaborne. At the end of the Cold War, because nuclear weapons were not as important as they were during the Cold War, and it was a peace dividends, we had to reduce military expenses. It was decided to drop the ground component, especially because, in fact, they were partly made to target Germany in case of Soviet invasion. When Germany was reunified, there were serious talks between France and Germany explained, it might be nice for you to drop the weapons that you can use to target our country. France complied. It was also because nuclear weapons were not really in fashion anymore. It helped France to cut its arsenal by half, from around 600 strategic nuclear warheads by the end of the Cold War to around 300 strategic nuclear warheads today. Contrary to the US or to Russia, all the warheads are deployed We don't have warheads in reserve and are spread between the 4 French SSBN, so the nuclear submarines, and the 2 squadrons, around maybe 40 fighter jets of Rafale that can carry the nuclear airborne cruise missile of the French Strategic Air Force.
It was obvious early on that France did not have the means to develop an arsenal that could be based on counterforce strategies or follow the trends of the Soviet Union or the US, but that you have the strategy you can afford. And so it based it on the idea of strict sufficiency, which means that the goal is to have enough forces to create serious damages that would be a deterrent for any attack for major adversaries, but not to go beyond and not to look at exactly all the targets you could actually consider in an adversary. This notion, however, can move. It is going to be built on a number of issues, including, for instance, how well the adversary is defending itself and how many weapons would be judged necessary to actually create those damages. So it can be reviewed by the president. One of the specificities of the French nuclear doctrine is this notion of final warning or just a warning. The French does not have the means, does not have the doctrine to answer to a nuclear strike by a nuclear strike and to try to escalate, I would say, at the reciprocal level. It does not intend to lead a nuclear war or to do limited strikes. It's completely foreign in the French doctrine. However, there's the idea that threatening to do nothing or to do a massive response could be a bit extreme and could a lack of credibility, and that it could be useful to have something in between. And that something in between is this notion of warning. The nuclear warning can happen in any situation. There's no preset of scenario where it could happen. It doesn't have to happen at all. We could imagine a massive retaliation without a warning. At this stage, the president has this option of striking with this kind of limited strike with the idea that maybe the adversary did not realize that it was crossing the threshold of the French vital interests, and that this warning shot is going to be a way for the adversary to understand that it has to back down. This warning is not going to be repeated, and the next time is going to be massive retaliation. The notion of vital interest is really key and core and is repeated extensively. And this idea that only the president can determine what is vital interest or not, so that it's really a personal responsibility to assess if the damage that the country has received or if the level of the attack is sufficient to lead to nuclear retaliation. This connection with the president of the republic is really emphasized in the deterrent. Something that goes with that is that while the doctrine itself is rather restrained in many ways, France does not accept easily formal restraints. The idea is really to keep options open for the president. We will not, for instance, declare no first use policy or declare that nuclear weapons would only be used in response to nuclear aggression. There are other elements like this where France is very reluctant to commit because the idea is that really the president is going to judge if the situation is in the field of nuclear deterrence or not. And so there is a kind of reluctance to commit in the current context to anything that could limit its freedom of action.
Within the French nuclear doctrine, there is this refusal of the idea of nuclear escalation and nuclear warfighting. That's why we don't have tactical nuclear weapons, contrary, for example, to the US, that have this idea of nuclear warfighting and the idea that a nuclear war could be done. It's not present in the French nuclear doctrine because a nuclear war on European continent will be a nuclear war for everyone, and it won't be limited, in fact. The current damages that can be done by nuclear warheads, even with a low yield, would be damageful for the whole country that is attacked. The imbrication between European countries are so huge, and the small scale, in fact, of the European continent would make this limited nuclear war not limited at all for European countries. The airborne component of the French nuclear deterrence is in fact divided in two. So we have the strategic air force, and we have also something else that is very unique to France. The US used to have that by the end of the Cold War. It's the naval nuclear air force, Marine, so from the French Navy Air Force, that are able to land and to take off from the French aircraft carrier with nuclear weapons. So basically, the French aircraft carrier is equipped to host nuclear weapons if needed, so nuclear cruise missiles if needed. And you have a part of the Naval Air Force fleet that can carry nuclear weapons It's unique amongst the nuclear weapon states. It gives an additional flexibility to the French president. It's also very useful for strategic signaling because if you have both the aircraft carrier and the Rafale marine planes and that it is known that nuclear weapons are on board and you sail near China or maybe in the northern Atlantic, it gives a very strong signal. Nuclear weapons could be used by the French president if the vital interests of France are being threatened by another nuclear weapon state. So it's really short, meaning that we don't have, like the US, for example, a nuclear posture review where we laid out precisely what is the French nuclear policy. It's only, in fact, a speech, meaning that each president gives usually 2-3 years after their entry to power, they usually give a speech on the defense policy of France. And within this speech, they can include slight changes to the French nuclear doctrine based on their own understanding of the doctrine, but also maybe their past experiences with nuclear weapons. Since the end of the Cold War, the French nuclear doctrine pretty much stayed the same. So strictly defensive, made to deter any attack against vital interests. There are no lists of vital interests because if you say precisely to your adversary, okay, I will answer with nuclear weapons only if you hit like this and this, but if you hit something else, I won't answer. Usually we understand vital interest as the integrity of the French state, its ability to still function as a state. Also the integrity not of the whole territory, but at least not losing a whole region of France like we did in the 19th century because of the war with the German Empire. It's pretty large and pretty narrow at the same time. It's fully up to the French president to decide whether to use nuclear weapons. And that's why the French president is directly elected, meaning that the French citizens directly vote for who they want to be the president. French presidents, on the first day of their mandate, are taken into the bunker from where they can see the whole situation about French nuclear weapons. And they are immediately given the codes and the processes to launch a nuclear weapon. And so there's a position of the French president is in fact very deeply linked to the French nuclear deterrence. Because it takes time to write a speech on nuclear weapons, on nuclear deterrence, because it's such a sensitive topic and really based on words, in fact. Because, of course, the objectives of nuclear weapons is not to use a nuclear weapon. You have to produce what we call strategic signaling in order to demonstrate your potential willingness to use nuclear weapons if needed. It can go through exercises and it can go through speeches, and so it takes a lot of time to write one. For example, President Macron came to power in May 2017 and he made his speech in February 2020. It takes a lot of time and many people asked about it, like experts, but also officials and diplomats. Two components, one airborne, one seaborne, are currently undergoing a modernization. There are always programs to update the warheads, both for the cruise missiles and also for the submarine-launched ballistic missiles. The missiles themselves are being updated with new standards. So the M51.3 standard of the SLBM missile was tested, I think, last year. We are expecting the standard 0.4 maybe in the next year or quite soon. And the ISMPR, the current cruise missile for the Strategic Air Force, is going to be replaced maybe in 10 years, less than 10 years, during the 30s, with the ISN-4G that will be hypersonic. For the moment, the cruise missile is supersonic, and the next one will be hypersonic in order to have a further maneuverability while keeping a hypersonic speed. The third generation of SSBN should be put at sea again in around 10 years. About the Rafale, it's a bit more complicated because we're supposed to build the future aircraft combat system with some European countries, but it doesn't go as quickly as we would like to. We might just need to continue updating the current fighter of the Air Force so for it to be still able to conduct the nuclear raid. The two components are being modernized, both the carriers and the weapons. That's why we see a slight increase of the budget of the French armed forces dedicated to nuclear weapons, because of course modernization is quite expensive. We don't have any plans to increase the number of warheads. First, because all the installations to produce enriched plutonium were dismantled by the beginning of this century. It will be more difficult to produce fissile matter to build new warheads. all the plutonium that are used in the French nuclear warheads are recycled. When a warhead is too old, the fissile material are removed and recycled in order to make a new strategic warhead. And also all the testing facilities were dismantled 30 years ago, contrary, for example, to Russia or to the United States. France is not able to do nuclear tests again. So we are a full signatory of the CTBT, so the Treaty Against Nuclear Testing, and meaning that we rely only on simulation programs, so mathematical, physical, chemical simulation programs, to continue updating the French nuclear warheads. The French contribution to the defense of Europe is very old. One of the first white papers about defense in France in 1972, so that it is considered as the first strategic document on nuclear weapons and nuclear doctrine in France, because we had the full triad by that time. It's written that French nuclear weapons are made to defend France, French vital interests, French territory, but also French approaches. So what does it mean? We don't really know, but it is interpreted as maybe the protection of French closest neighbors, at the time West Germany, Belgium, Luxembourg, maybe Italy, against possible threats to their own vital interests. This European dimension of the French vital interest was really reiterated throughout the whole 20th century with more or less advanced ideas. For example, by the 90s, there was ideas about what we call dissuasion concertée, so concerted deterrence between France and some other European countries who might be ready to talk about, so not sharing the decision to launch a nuclear weapon and not deploying a French nuclear weapon in other countries, the US extended deterrence, but at least talk about really concretely how French nuclear weapons could contribute to their defense and deterrence. France is fully independent in the development of its nuclear weapons regarding the industrial capacities, of course, the decision to launch a nuclear weapon, but in fact, it also contributes to NATO. Even though we are not in the nuclear planning group and we came back in the Integrated Command of NATO in 2008, several declarations acknowledge the role of France's independent nuclear deterrence and its contribution to the global NATO defense and deterrence posture. Even though for the moment France doesn't participate in, for example, the steadfast noon exercises, the NATO nuclear exercises, but at the same time, because the Supreme Allied Commander transformation, so basically one of the two military chiefs of NATO is French, it means that he can participate to the NPG. So there is still a French representation to the nuclear decision-making groups of NATO. French nuclear deterrence is independent by nature, but due to the strategic evolutions of the world and the strategic competition and the war in Ukraine and so on, France understands that it's only for the benefit of everyone, including France, to further contribute to NATO nuclear deterrence and also to the protection of European countries. France came back to the military integrated command of NATO in 2008. We never left the political bodies of NATO, but Nicolas Sarkozy decided to come back to the military structures of NATO in 2008. He felt that there was a change in the strategic environment that needed France to be maybe back into a very efficient military alliance. With Macron's speech in February 2020, when he said very clearly that the French vital interests have a European dimension and that he was ready to invite European countries to learn more about the French nuclear deterrence and to build together a shared strategic culture between European countries. Why did he say that and what does it mean? First, he said that because he saw the consequences of the first mandate of Donald Trump, so from 2017 to 2021, with the first scare of the US being less involved in the defense of Europe. And it was also the consequences of Crimea and annexion by Russia in 2014. The fact that Europe didn't really do anything about it, apart from sanctions, and it was not really efficient because we saw what it provoked in 2022 with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. He felt that the strategic environment was changing and that Europe may be not safe from external aggression. So it was time to think collectively within Europe about common defense and strategic deterrence. He made his speech in February 2020, and 1 month later, whole Europe and almost the whole world was in lockdown because of COVID. You can't really talk about nuclear deterrence with your partners on Zoom. This invitation was put aside during 2 years, also because I don't think it was concrete enough, and I don't think that European countries were able to fully understand why and what did Macron meant through this sentence. But we saw a new momentum of this French proposition about contributing to the European defense after February 2022, and now that we have full-scale war on the European territory, and that the US support might have not been as, let's say, intense that it was expected, France is not there to replace the US extended deterrence. First, because we don't have the political credibility to do it. We don't have enough warheads to fully replace the US extended deterrence. The idea is more to give an additional layer of security, an additional insurance, and trying to play on the fact that a limited aggression, for example, by Russia on Poland that would threaten the Poland vital interests would necessarily have consequences on the French vital interests because of the construction of Europe, because of the interlinkage between Poland and France, for example. That's where the biggest difference between France, not really extended deterrence, but possible French contribution to European defense, and the US extended deterrence is because France is directly concerned in its own existence by everything that can happen on the European continent. It's less the case for the United States. That's why France developed its own independent nuclear deterrence, because we didn't really believe in this US extended deterrence. That's why France considered itself maybe not more credible, but at least credible to give this additional layer of insurance to willing European countries. But again, there is a difference between the US and this French offer, because for the moment there are no talks about putting French nuclear weapons outside of the French territory. First, because it will be difficult regarding the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The idea is more to advance, let's say, on a political side, trying to find at a very high level shared vital interests between, for example, France and Sweden or France and Germany, and thinking about military translations of this political commitment. For example, participation of foreign armies in French nuclear exercises, maybe having the French Air Force nuclear raid exercise take place outside of the French airspace, having many visits of foreign diplomats to the SSBN base, for example. There are plenty of ideas, but we are lacking French political guidance about it.
The role played by the French nuclear deterrence for Europe has been recognized very early on. At the time of the General de Gaulle, there was already this idea that the French nuclear forces, just by its position in Europe and the fact that obviously if France was under attack, other countries had been invaded by the Soviet. We would probably not wait until the Soviet Union was at the border to actually have a reaction. After the Cold War, there was some discussion at the very high political level about the role that French nuclear forces could play. There was not a lot of interest from European partners. Today, two trends are pushing the topic back a bit on the agenda. The first one is that the security situation is worsening in Europe. European partners are more inclined to see nuclear deterrence as something that can contribute to their security. The second factor is that the US extended deterrence can appear less reliable because of Donald Trump. It's expected that the US is not going to continue to be so active and so present to defend European security, but might be more willing to commit its resources on the Asia-Pacific theater. Both trends have really increased the interest and the thinking here in Paris, but also elsewhere, that France is now the only nuclear power on the continent of Europe. France has some interests out of its borders, and that if some countries were attacked massively in Europe, it would affect its vital interests. It's not so much an extended deterrence as in NATO, but more a recognition that there are interests of the security of Europe, and therefore independent nuclear deterrence can play a role in protecting indirectly other European nations.
Our next guest reflects on recent conversations about expanding the role of French nuclear weapons beyond its function as a national deterrent.
I'm Liviu Horovitz. I work for the SWP in Berlin, and I generally do research on nuclear policy issues and particularly on nuclear deterrence. What could be the purpose of the French nuclear arsenal for European security? Is this a complementary segment in relation to the arsenal of the United States, or to get to the security assurances that Washington offers its European allies? Or is this a replacement should the United States decide to withdraw its nuclear assurances towards Europe? Some people argue that this is possible for France to replace the United States, but the majority argue that given current constraints, be them in relation to France's arsenal, but also in relation to France's relations to its neighbors, also regarding France's position in the European architecture, that this is not possible. Then comes the next dimension of what would need to change. And the problem is that the dimension of change that would need to happen is simply very large. Many things would need to happen for France to be able to take on that role. Those changes are expensive, both from a financial perspective and, more important, from a political, from a strategic perspective. And for those to happen, we would need to have a political imperative. Conversely, the suggestions that everybody brings to the table today are all small steps that would happen within the current architecture that is not confronted with, at least at time zero, at a point in time now, basically, is not confronted with such a large pressure that would warrant those massive changes in doctrine, in arsenal, in security approach. A lot of the proposals are very good at enhancing France's role in European security and creating an additional or better positioned additional pillar in European nuclear deterrence, but they in no way would those steps suffice for France to replace the United States. Why are we talking about France in the first place? Because Emmanuel Macron a couple of years ago held a speech in which he basically said, "You folks come to Paris and we talk about nuclear deterrence." And nobody really understood what is on the table, what is he actually talking about. As people asked more questions, it became clear there was one educational component. France thought it could share more about how to educate its neighbors on how the nuclear deterrence works and why it is so important to have nuclear deterrence. This is a couple of years ago. A lot of the countries in Europe were not very convinced in the first place that nuclear weapons were necessary. That perception has been significantly or severely altered through Russia's war against Ukraine and the use of nuclear rhetoric by Moscow. And hence, maybe that component is slightly muted. The other component was France's offer to get other states in Europe involved in its own nuclear exercises, in its own thinking about nuclear policy. However, that involvement is mainly geared towards creating some redundancy, not taking over parts of France's nuclear deterrence or nuclear responsibilities, nuclear arsenal, but adding a couple of layers potentially as going down the road. And at first, becoming more familiar with how the French are doing nuclear deterrence. This is the starting point. And on top of the starting point, a number of both officials and experts have placed various steps that could be taken. Where exactly, which kind of exercise could be attended, what kind of capabilities, who could add to the French dimension, and so on. Then, of course, there was quite a bit of discussion, for instance, about funding French nuclear efforts, with numerous people also in Germany advancing the proposition, the French need money, we have maybe a bit of money, we should do that. And then the voices responded with, no, you don't understand. That's not at all what we actually meant. There was dialogue that is not exactly on the same wavelength between what the government in Paris has in mind and what various commentators actually believe to be ideal. So those are just another slight incongruence about who wants what. If you talk to French officials, they say, come to Paris and we will talk about how nuclear deterrence should happen, how various countries should position themselves in various UN fora, also towards other pieces of nuclear diplomacy, and then we will take it further from there. Basically, we cannot put anything on the table for as long as we don't know where the discussion is going to take us. Conversely, if you ask officials in Berlin, they say, why would we come to Paris if we don't know what you want to exactly talk about? So one side says, let's talk and we'll see where the road leads us. And the other side says, if we don't know where you want to go, then why would we start on a road? A lot of people have given thought to how to react to Moscow's rhetoric, and French officials have been quite purposeful about making various statements, especially at the beginning of Russia's war against Ukraine, making not only statements as to France also being a nuclear power, another center of decision and of influencing Russia's calculations, but also by taking clear measures, sending another submarine out at sea, and hence signaling to Moscow that they also are playing a role. However, in the grand scheme of things, most nuclear communication throughout this crisis came from Washington. And if one is to believe what Russian officials say in public, they also seem to be significantly more concerned with Washington's signals and Washington's positions than they are with either London or Paris's action. But this is obviously just from watching open source statements, how the Russians react, what kind of discussions they have behind closed doors that nobody knows. At the other end of the spectrum is the fundamental question of what would happen if the Americans were to rescind their nuclear assurances, basically from Europe. In other words, and it's worth mentioning that there is a bit of confusion also in Germany, but also throughout the commentariat, with a lot of people believing that it is possible for the United States to say, we're not doing nuclear deterrence, but we're doing other sort of security assurances. Extended nuclear deterrence is the last and not the first step in Europe. Even a Trump administration bent to reduce the US role in Europe would rather focus on the conventional aspects and leave nuclear deterrence as the final step before they pack up and go home. Now, a lot of people are really worried about the fate of the transatlantic security arrangements in a Trump administration, and they are thinking about the hypothetical of ensuring European nuclear deterrence without the United States. The fundamental problem is that extended deterrence is hard. The French are pretty good at deterring an adversary from attacking France. But how credible were they to argue that they provide extended deterrence for all of Europe? There are two questions. Do the Russians believe them? And the second and more important question is, do their allies believe them? Do they feel sufficiently secure under such a promise to A, not develop their own nuclear weapons, or B, not to go to Moscow and strike some sort of parallel deals in order to preempt the possibility of Russian nuclear coercion? And some of these nations might not be willing to do one or the other. They might run first to Washington to see whether there is some sort of bilateral option there, assuming that everybody would be on the same page and France would try to do it. The question is, how credible is it? For the United States, it's been pretty hard to reassure the Europeans. It had built a relatively large and relatively diverse nuclear arsenal and has also integrated its European partners in some form of consultative process. Most people inherently look at this example of how it's been done in the past and think how France could adapt its posture, its forces to fit more that sort of arrangement. Because France has a much, much smaller and much, much less diversified nuclear arsenal, it doesn't have any sort of institutional framework in which it would be able to integrate its allies. The road is very long. Yes, it's possible, but it's very expensive, very cumbersome, and basically Paris would have to do a lot in order to achieve even a moderately similar or even going in that direction. Many people, conversely, have argued, have proposed that less would be sufficient. And the question is, how much less? The fundamental question here is not whether you need a large arsenal, because France already has sufficient nuclear weapons to inflict unacceptable damage on the Russian Federation. If were it to inflict such unacceptable damage on the Russian Federation, Moscow could answer by also inflicting unacceptable damage on France. The question then becomes, how do you persuade your allies that you're willing to potentially accept such tremendous cost in order to protect them, so as to deter the other side from even trying to test your resolve, to actually push you to see whether you're actually serious about your promises? And hence, within this framework, the solution chosen by the United States was to diversify its nuclear arsenal, to have the ability to not immediately go for counter value, for hitting population centers, for hitting very important and crucial targets on the other side, but to use nuclear weapons in the theater, to use nuclear weapons to attack the arsenal of the other power, and hence to keep the strategic dimension of going all in further down the road, thus increasing its own credibility that it might potentially use nuclear weapons in defense of their allies. This is just one way of doing this. You can increase your political credibility by saying the other side is so important because we are the same country. They are not just allies that we might or might not care, but we have a political union. So were we Europeans to create a supranational, basically a United States of Europe, probably a pretty small nuclear arsenal will be sufficient for everybody. Maybe even the arsenal that France and Britain together have today might be sufficient to provide overarching nuclear deterrence. Then we would have to look at the conventional aspects and what is credible to defend our borders within this situation. But we don't have a United States of Europe. The next question is what else can be done beyond that nuclear dimension, beyond that large arsenal and so on. The other question is how do you demonstrate if you don't have a political union and not one state, and you're not protecting your citizens that elect a central government that they are all deserving your protection, how do you demonstrate still that you care enough? You can do that, for instance, by deploying a lot of military personnel towards the borders that are most endangered. We're talking here about hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and they will basically fight for those allies. They will fight a long fight. They will die. And you will then reinforce them. You will transform your economy. You will fight a conventional war for Europe, for your allies. And that conventional war might then escalate to the nuclear level, at which point then it's unquestionable that your fundamental interests are being touched, and hence you will then go to the nuclear level and you might actually be able to escalate it. It is not impossible to do it. It's creating that plausibility, ensuring the other nations that you're actually willing to do. It's rather difficult. If we look at the political problems that France seems to have today, that seems to be a bridge that is rather hard to cross.
Emmanuelle Maitre concludes with thoughts on the French position on arms control.
Regarding the future, the French vision has always been rather cautious and now is rather pessimistic about the evolution of the strategic environment. There is really a willingness to keep nuclear deterrence at the center of the defense policy. Where France maybe is a bit unique is that it's never really considered that nuclear weapons were out of date or that it should become a less important part of our military investments in the current context. It remains extremely central and is really highlighted as something that is absolutely necessary to deal with the return of major power competition. France has observed the degradation of the arms control environment and has been once again thinking that in the current context, strategic stability was best served by a strong deterrence posture, with this idea that arms control and deterrence, two things that go together because they can both prevent aggression and they can both avoid incentives for an adversary to start an aggression. This idea is that if we are strong and if we are credible, the opponents are not going to feel that there is a place for them to be successful in leading an aggression. This is really a message that is coming through, that strategic stability is served by a strong deterrence posture and that the immediate priority is to invest and make sure that the deterrence posture is credible and well-funded across the board in France, in NATO and elsewhere. Second element, I would say it goes hand in hand with efforts to work on strategic risk reduction and to look where there might be avenues to adopt some measures at the unilateral level or at the more multilateral or any kind of levels, see what measures would be useful to limit the risks. There has been some declarations, for instance, on keeping a human in the loop of nuclear decision-making, or regarding space, or regarding new technologies and so on. Regarding formal arms control and the possibility that we may see a follow-up of the New START Treaty or INF Treaty, in principle, there is support for anything that can bring transparency and avoid arms race dynamics in the major nuclear powers. There is some concern if, for instance, it's propositions coming from Russia that wants to include the French and British arsenals in the count of what Western nuclear weapons are. But otherwise, if something looked credible and possibly can be verified, France would probably support the initiative. What is interesting, if we look at other Western countries, is really the fact that the French nuclear is so central in shaping the whole military and in shaping the investments that are being made, in determining what kind of planes are going to be bought or how many attack submarines are going to be procured. It's really central, and we see it when we talk with people in the forces, especially, of course, the Navy and the Air Forces, which are really dimensioned to be able to carry that mission. But there's also something to be said about the fact that there's really no contestation or debate about the continuity of nuclear deterrence in France. It doesn't mean that there is a broad support or that the population is usually dedicated to that, but there's no debate about it. There's no really questioning in the parliament or elsewhere.
Thank you for listening, and to our guests and the European Union's Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium for funding the series. Until next time, stay optimistic.